Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is retiring, and this is according to NBC News first reporting this. And of course, we know that that gives President Joe Biden a crucial opportunity to replace the liberal justice. Now, Emily, I'm coming right back to you and your legal acumen. Play this out for me. He leaves, and what do you see happening immediately?
That President Joe Biden will nominate another justice. And we know that, so just a few months ago, he nominated 2 new federal appeals court judges, right? One including a South Carolina judge that some saw as a U.S. Supreme Court contender. That was U.S. District Judge Michelle Childs, and that was to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Now, I think what's important to note as well that this would have an impact, obviously, on the scale of the court in general. This is considered, frankly, a win for the Democrat Party, a win for the progressive liberals. But that being said, let's dig into the background of whoever he does nominate and look forward to that being a contentious process as we've seen in the past, Harris.
Kayleigh.
Yeah, look, this would not change the balance of the court, but it could deliver the White House a much needed political win, Harris. This is big news. This is right before the midterms. Yeah, I imagine this would have went into Justice Breyer's calculus. Any Supreme Court justice thinks about who they want to appoint their replacement. So I think he knows the balance of the Senate could change. Right now it's 50-50 in the Senate. So the best chance of getting a judge that would walk in the footsteps of Justice Breyer would be to have President Biden nominate that justice, get that person through before the midterms. And look, I was in the White House when we nominated a Supreme Court justice just before a presidential election, and that was Justice Amy Coney Barrett. That's about as clean as a nomination you could have and about as easy of a political victory you could have when you have a nominee of such character. But these could be thorny issues, Harris. We all remember Justice Kavanaugh, a great man. I think he's a great justice. However, no one knew the kind of way Democrats would play political football with his past, with his childhood. So it's not a given that you would get someone through. They have to have a good nominee, someone like Amy Coney Barrett, at least with a clean record, easy to confirm just before a crucial election.
So I really want to get into some of what we've seen, though, Guy, and that is this idea that it's too close to an election to get something like this through for a president. We've seen it among Republicans. We've seen Democrats do this as well. It's January, and you can't miss the timing of how far out that is from November. It's not March, it's not May, so on and so forth. What do you make of how much time President Biden would have to put something through? And as Kayleigh just pointed out, you pretty much have to pick somebody perfect at this point because you don't have a stall time.
Let's also not forget that Biden promised on the campaign trail that no matter who retired or died from the court, if he had an opportunity to replace that person on the high court, he would pick a black woman. So that narrows the field of potential names probably being discussed right now in the White House. I would imagine that there are a lot of conference calls and Zoom calls between the president's team and the Senate Majority Leader to make sure that they don't screw this up. Right now, they have the votes in the Senate. I would imagine the Democrats are probably going to stick together on this one, and they will replace Justice Breyer, likely with an African-American woman. I think they'll have the time to do it. I think they will maybe barely have the votes to do it. And I think, yes, it is true, Kayleigh's point is right, that this would be a victory for the Biden administration and for the president, and the base will probably be happy about that. There's also the other side of it. This will also fire up the Republican base and remind people that, okay, in this case, the ideological balance on the court would not shift. It would be one, progressive justice to another, but these are very high stakes battles. There's a lot at stake in control of the Senate, for example. So I'm not sure on balance if it would benefit one party or the other. I just think that in all likelihood, we're going to see a black woman nominated and a black woman confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court if indeed these reports about Justice Breyer are true, and the timing would suggest, in my mind, that it would make sense that they would be true.
Look, we are projecting recent past onto present, and we don't know what will happen next. But based on the facts that we have seen, what you were describing, and you too, Kayleigh, in terms of this, continues to make it feel like the U.S. Supreme Court is in the middle politically. Do you see it that way, Guy?
Well, I mean, of course. The U.S. Supreme Court, the decisions that are being written as we speak, I mean, the court's going to rule on guns, on abortion, racial preferences and college admissions, some of the most divisive, polarizing, hot-button issues in our society often come down to the court. I think that's unfortunate. I think that the court has overreached, and I think having some of these decisions sent back to the people's representatives would be the right course of action. But because these huge issues often end up before 9 lawyers, of course, the politics for people like us immediately jump to the forefront when news like this breaks.
Yeah, so Tommy, I think what Guy was saying previously is also very interesting because, and I think Kayleigh and Emily said it too, this doesn't change the makeup of the court. It does give Joe Biden, President Biden, a win politically, but it doesn't change some of the decisions potentially might have a conservative majority on that court.
Yeah, it doesn't change the ideological makeup, but we know that what Joe Biden does best is placate to the radical element and the radical progressive base of his party that he believes is the majority. I believe he's incorrect in that. I believe that they're actually the minority. But I'm wondering the kind of justice that he would nominate. Now, again, I'm sure it will be, as Guy said, a black woman. You know, he's got a dedication to that. We saw how well that worked out with Kamala Harris, but here's to hoping that he has a better choice in mind for this position. But I would just hope that he would choose somebody that is not only qualified, but maybe somebody that's not so far on the radical left. I think the American people are making it pretty clear that the wokeism that's going on right now in the Democrat Party is not for them. But I think we need to take a step back, too, and see how we're all projecting politics on the court. And maybe we shouldn't do that so much, especially the media. I mean, just last week you had NPR writing a story about this so-called controversy and debacle between the masking of Neil Gorsuch with Sonia Sotomayor, and they came out and said that that wasn't true. So why are people trying to have so much fighting, so much divide? We should have a moment of unity. I know the court's always going to be a contentious issue, but I think that we need to do a better job of making it less political where we can.
Emily, you know, just in terms of what potentially the court would be looking at, what do we know about maybe what Justice Breyer and his judicial history have looked like, and what Tommy is suggesting is, well, maybe you find somebody farther to the left. Like, if Democrats don't make up if the ideology of Democrats don't make up the majority on the court anyway, would it matter so much if there were somebody who were even farther left than, say, a Sotomayor?
Right, that's a great question. And I will say that this is sort of interesting, and it dovetails in what Guy was saying earlier, that there are rumors floating around already. You know, the short list potentially includes one of the judges that I mentioned earlier, who is presently a circuit court judge, Judge Jackson, and then also that was Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, and also California Supreme Court Justice Leondra Kruger, both of those African-American women, both of those Harvard grads, Kayleigh. But yes, they are progressive, one appointed by Obama, one appointed by Jerry Brown, squarely Democrat Party. But to your point, Harris, ideologically, yes, they are further to the left than Breyer. However, Breyer's jurisprudence was incredibly progressive, frankly. Right. He was in no way a swing vote by any means. And so I think filling that position would be definitely a square with a square if you chose someone in that ideological bent. And recall as well that as we sort of led up to this moment, there was a respectful distance, frankly, that many in the Democrat Party, including and especially the president, were giving Justice Breyer. Granted, we know and we covered people who were calling outright for him to retire in fear and concern that they would miss that boat. However, this president maintained a distance, and he committed to, he said, filling the federal court vacancies in the lower systems. He has filled over 70 positions, among them now Justice Jackson of the D.C. Circuit Court. So I think what was interesting is that this president played it safely by letting Justice Breyer make this call on his own, and then sort of set this deep bench at the lower circuit and appellate level, so that now from which he can draw. But to Guy's point, yes, he has voiced commitment to African-American judges in the past, and it looks like that shortlist does include Kruger and Jackson, like I mentioned. And the hearings back in May, by the way, some thought that that was sort of a test case for the potential SCOTUS nomination process for Justice Jackson. And so that might have, frankly, laid the framework for her to be nominated coming up now.
That's really interesting. And you know what else? I mean, look, we don't know. We can't be flies on the room. But does anybody at that level ever make a decision on their own? Like, do you think that he just woke up this morning and said, I'm leaving the court? I mean, everybody sees the politics here. Everybody sees potentially what could happen. Jen Psaki, White House press secretary, tweeted this 9 minutes ago. It has always been the decision of any Supreme Court justice if and when they decide to retire and how they want to announce it. And that remains the case today. We have no additional details or information to share from the White House. Now, I put that there because on the heels of the comment that I had just made. She already sees these questions coming. Did the president talk to him? Like, what's this like, Kayleigh?
That's a great point, Harris, because that statement that you just read indicates that, yes, he chose to retire on his own, but was there ever a conversation between Breyer and Biden? There's been a lot of reporting that there was a conversation between Justice Kennedy, who retired, and President Trump at the time, and that Kennedy said, you know, I'd like for Kavanaugh to be considered as my replacement. As it turned out, that's what transpired. Kavanaugh was the replacement nominated for Kennedy. So were there any such similar discussions? It would not be improper, but it would be interesting to know if that existed and if that changed. You know, Biden's vow to nominate a black female, maybe Breyer had someone in mind and he said, consider this person. It could have changed the calculus. I will say, I don't think you can overstate how important this moment is for the White House, Harris. I mean, you think about everything happening, everything going wrong, Biden's domestic agenda, Build Back Better being dead in the water, Ukraine, Afghanistan, the southern border, the economy, crime. This is a chance for Biden, in his mind, I would argue, to have a reset, to have a political victory, to change the conversation ahead of the midterms. I think Democrats would prefer to be having a conversation on Roe v. Wade over a conversation on the current issues top of mind of voters, the economy, crime, political unity, according to our Fox News poll. You know, I'm a pro-life Republican. I want to see Roe v. Wade overturned, but I think it is in the mind of Democrats. They would rather switch to that kind of conversation. They want to use this moment to do that. In the Biden administration, desperate for a political win. This could be that for them.
Wow, that is quite a look at this. I mean, Kayleigh, you've been in a White House and dealing with communications and sometimes changing the subject. I mean, it is something that we know that every White House will do. I don't know if this turns the wheel or even a spoke of a wheel away from what's happening in Eastern Europe if Russia now invades Ukraine and those 8,500 troops, United States troops, have to go and be in NATO countries to get ready. And I don't know if this changes anything, our attention away at all. Americans can multitask. Tommy.
Yeah, again, I think that Kayleigh's right. The Biden administration would love to have this kind of a win, but it really is, in essence, an empty virtue signal because it's not going to change much, but that would give them the opportunity to talk about something else. I don't think the American people are that easily distracted, though. It might be one thing if we didn't have empty shelves and worker shortages and inflation and gas prices and foreign policy debacles. Yeah, we have all those things. So it'd be great to say, you know, we put a African-American woman on the Supreme Court. That's a great headline for a couple of weeks. But when you can't afford to buy groceries and your gas prices are going through the roof, I think you're still going to vote for those America First, hopefully Republicans, in my eyes, conservatives, that are going to make sure that those things can be fixed. So a great win for them optically, but in practice, yeah, I don't think the American people are going to be so sold.